Thank you very much. Thanks, Tosca, for this opportunity, not just to have this meeting with you all, but for the opportunity to come and take some time out from work and do some serious reflection, which, as you said, is very difficult to do when you're faced with the day-to-day pressures of working in an NGO. And I'm sure that those of you who are here on fellowships will agree with me that it's a real privilege to be able to do this. So thank you for making that happen. I also want to thank you all for coming here today, particularly on International Women's Day. I feel like we need to mark that in some way. Happy Women's Day. The fact that you've come to this talk doesn't absolve you from the need to mark International Women's Day in some other more meaningful way. But thank you nevertheless for coming along today. What I'm going to say, I want to keep this fairly informal and hopefully interactive as well, is going to focus in two parts, really. I wanted to talk a little bit first about what we mean by economic and social rights, where they come from, how they emerged on the agenda, particularly on the civil society agenda. So a little bit about their historical evolution. And forgive me for those of you who already know this, for whom this is familiar. This will be well-known territory for you. But since I'm hearing that lots of you are coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, it may be useful just to bring everybody up to speed. And I also want to focus more on some current trends and challenges in the field, particularly from my perspective as a practitioner in an international NGO working on these rights. And one of those challenges would include the teasing out the relationship, the sometimes complicated relationship between human rights and development practice, and to what extent economic and social rights really has been a bridge between those two fields. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, just images, just to make my talk a little bit more colourful, I guess. So don't expect graphs or statistics. I don't have any of those for you. So what do we mean by economic and social rights? Well, let me throw out that question to you. How would you encapsulate in one sentence what economic and social rights are? What do we mean by economic and social rights? I don't need to define, give me a list. I just mean how would you describe economic and social rights? Just off the top of your head.
Everybody having equal social and economic status in society.
Equal social economic status. Any other ideas?
Equal opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
Increase of salary, increase of living standards.
A couple more.
Conditions with dignity.
Okay. Conditions to live with dignity.
I would say equitable distribution of economic and social capital.
Okay. One last. Room for one last definition.
The ability to participate in one's own culture and, without restriction.
These are great definitions or great descriptions, but the immediately striking thing is how varied they are, and yet they're all correct. I would say. I mean, they're all on target. They all accurately do describe what economic and social rights are about. It's interesting. Some of you honed in straight away on the question of equality and inequality, a concern for equality of opportunity or treatment. Some of you focused in on particular aspects of the economic and social rights agenda, like the right to work, increases in salary, or rights at work. Some chose a formulation around living standards, living with dignity, the concept of dignity, and there was also the notion of equity in the distribution of economic and social capital. So all of these issues are absolutely pertinent, and I'm forgetting also the fundamentally important question that you raised, Christiane, of participation, of the notion of participation, and also cultural rights, the participation in one's own culture. All of those are important issues and important dimensions of the economic and social rights agenda. One way of describing them, and this is no better or no worse, but one way of describing and perhaps linking all of these things, is that in simple terms, economic and social rights are those rights which are related to the ability to enjoy an adequate standard of living and to lead a dignified life. Picking up on Nicolas's concept of dignity, which I think is fundamental to the understanding. So roughly, this isn't a textbook legal definition. This is just my own summary of what economic and social rights, how they might be described. Rights related to the ability to enjoy an adequate standard of living and to lead a dignified life. And they include rights such as the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to water and sanitation, or rights at work, as you mentioned, including rights related to social security when one is out of work, and social protection. These are just broad categories. So cultural rights are often included in with economic and social rights. But to some extent, they're relatively distinct in the sense that cultural rights, I think, are cross-cutting. They can also be civil and political rights. And you pointed to the rights associated with the ability to participate freely in one's own culture. I don't want to go into definitional questions, but I simply wanted to describe the contours of economic and social rights, which is what we'll be discussing here. Traditionally, these rights have been distinguished from another so-called category of rights, civil and political rights. But in reality, all of us in the work within the human rights movement are deeply skeptical about these rigid categorizations. Just because I work for an organization that has ESC right or economic and social rights on it in the label doesn't mean that we somehow privilege these rights over the full spectrum of rights. Indeed, all human rights really are interconnected, they're indivisible, and they're interdependent. Just look at any real-life example. People who live in poverty, in situations of extreme poverty, are facing deprivations of their rights at work or right to work, of their rights to health, their right to an adequate standard of living, but they're very often at the forefront, or those who bear the brunt of civil and political rights violations. They're often those who participate less in political processes. They're often in situations, for example, of slums in megacities. They're often those who face the most repressive policing, etc., etc. So these situations kind of illustrate, I think, the indivisibility and interdependence of all human rights. Okay, so where do these rights come from? Sorry, I'm forgetting my pictures. That was the first question. What are economic and social rights? So it's fine for me to say that, but where do these rights come from? Did I just invent them, or did I pick this up in a textbook? Well, in fact, they're not new rights. Often they're misleadingly, I think, talked of as second-generation rights. This is language that tries to categorize them as a distinct generation of rights, implying that they're somehow newer. But in fact, they have very long historical roots. I don't have time to go into those historical roots, but they go back to the writings of Thomas Paine and previous to his writing. So really, the notion that they're somehow newer than civil and political rights is a little bit historically misleading. They are included in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt is holding up here. A somewhat blurry Eleanor Roosevelt reading a blurry Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But what is absolutely clear, despite the blurriness, is that economic and social rights are included on an equal footing with civil and political rights. This is the point I want to make. There is no distinction. There is no. Can you see any black lines between the first paragraphs and the second? No, there are no rigid categorizations here or headings saying this is one set of rights and these are another set of rights. They're treated very much on an equal footing without any distinctions as to the nature or inherent importance of these rights. And these rights have been, the Universal Declaration is considered in some sense the cornerstone instrument of the modern human rights movement. And it was adopted by the UN immediately after the Second World War. Since then, a whole series of more binding legal treaties, international conventions and covenants have been adopted, which give flesh, in a way, to the provisions of the Universal Declaration. And ESC rights, economic, social and cultural rights, are codified in binding international treaties. There's a key treaty called the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is often seen as the main reference. But it's important to note that the UN has adopted a whole range of human rights conventions on particular issues which also address economic and social rights. chiefly among them I would mention the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, other conventions aiming at tackling race discrimination or promoting the rights of the child. More recently, in recent years, we've seen the adoption of the latest major human rights treaty, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this is very significantly is CRPD because it really has a holistic take on economic, social, civil, and political rights, cultural rights. There are also standards which are not currently, they don't have the same legal authority as a binding treaty on indigenous people's rights, but they're declarations. Declarations are different from conventions in the sense that they're adopted by consensus within the UN system or indeed within regional systems. But they don't have the binding weight of these international conventions. This is simply a legal distinction. But the hope is that people often term them soft law rather than hard law. But the hope is that soft law will, through usage and through reference, will eventually congeal is a horrible word, will eventually solidify, as if it's something disgusting, will eventually solidify into hard law. And increasingly, these rights, you'll find them mentioned in national constitutions, although, as I'll say a bit later on, they still tend to be more rather neglected comparatively in comparison to civil and political rights. So why, if this is the case, why even bother to distinguish between these categories of rights? Are they a separate category of rights? Well, they may be recognized as rights of equal standing in the Universal Declaration, but both nationally and internationally, these rights have been marginalized and neglected and subordinated and treated as of less importance and less intrinsic worth for decades. And I would argue that this is primarily, the subordination and neglect of ESG rights is primarily a casualty of the Cold War. Here we have the Berlin Wall, which is the link to what I'm saying. Because what we've seen, certainly up to the 90s, and even beyond the 90s, I would say, a kind of Berlin Wall was erected between civil and political rights on the one hand and economic and social rights on the other, with the West, I know it's a problematic term, but the so-called West championing primarily civil and political rights and principles and values of liberal democracy, usually championing those abroad rather than internalizing them domestically. They're certainly seeing themselves as international champions of civil and political rights primarily, and viewing economic and social rights at the very best as utopian and somewhat naive, and at worst a socialist agenda, a recipe for draconian authoritarian rule by the oppressive state. While the Soviet bloc, on the other hand, claimed to prioritize economic and social rights. I'll come back to why I say claim. They claimed to prioritize economic and social rights, or at least economic development and economic growth and the collective welfare over and above what they considered bourgeois individual civil and political rights. So you had this game going on during the Cold War, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, where one set of rights was subordinated to the other. And hence this categorization was a political construct. It's not something that is kind of legally well-founded, certainly. The disappearance of the Soviet bloc and the collapse of the Berlin Wall didn't mean the disappearance of economic and social rights. It didn't, just because the bloc that was championing disappeared didn't mean, thank God, that economic and social rights also disappeared off the agenda. Rather, the end of the Cold War saw what you might call the reunification of the human rights agenda, the reunification of civil and political and economic, social and cultural rights. And so in the 1990s, we returned to this notion, and there were international declarations within the UN reaffirming the notion of the indivisibility and interdependence of all human rights. In 1993, there was a very often cited World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, which emphasized that all human rights were of equal importance and really sought to end that qualitative divide that had existed. There's one paragraph that says, the international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. It is the duty of states, regardless of their political, economic and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So that's often seen in 1993 as the definitive statement on